St Gregory Palamas as a Hagiorite, written by Metropolitan of Nafpaktos, Hierotheos Vlachos, translated into English by Esther Williams, published by Birth, the Theotokos Monastery, Levadia, Greece, 2000. Preface to the English edition. I consider it a great blessing that my work, St Gregory Palamas as a Hagiorite, is published in English, for many reasons, but mainly because a significant turn can be observed nowadays in the West. It is a turn toward Orthodox life in its authentic expression, just as the Holy Fathers lived it and formulated it, and particularly St Gregory Palamas, who is the summation of all patristic teaching and Orthodox life. The reader will see in the pages to follow the importance of the subject and the reason why I have dealt with it. A serious subject for our days, as it is, and why I tried to see St. Gregory Palamas within the perspective of the Holy Mountain. What should be pointed out here is that many people today are studying the Orthodox life and teaching and enter the Orthodox Church. There is indeed a great zeal for inner-niptic and hesychastic life. I believe that this book will answer to this search and will be a help. The life, the conduct, and the teaching of this great Hagiorite father will guide all those who come to Orthodoxy in the right and Orthodox way. They will be taught authentically and genuinely the mysteries of the Spirit. Apart from this, I believe that the life and the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas, Archbishop of Thessaloniki, will set out the limits and the great difference which exists between the abstract and impersonal life of Eastern religions and the Orthodox tradition, as well as between Barlaam's scholasticism, moralism, and Orthodox spiritual life. And this is important precisely because tendencies which we have already referred to prevail in the West today, such as the impersonal way of life and scholasticism together with moralism, a fact that creates a deep despair and speculation. Moreover, the reading of this book will show the particular features of Byzantium, which used to be called Romania, the Roman Empire, as it is preserved and kept even in our days on the Holy Mountain. Nowadays, many people admire the art which developed in the Byzantine Roman Empire era, but in the final analysis, this art was the outcome of a holy life. It was the fruit of a way of life, as we can see in the life and teaching of St. Gregory Palamas. I glorify God for this new gift that he granted me. I also owe a great gratitude to Mrs. Esther Williams, who undertook this translation with zeal and love and with Rosalind's moral support. I remember that when she saw this book in its Greek edition, she took it in her hands, kissed the icon of St. Gregory on the cover, the same one with that of the English edition, held the book and said, "I love St. Gregory Palamas very much." And this book is the fruit of this love of hers. I also thank a lot Effie Mavromakali, who went through the English text in combination with the Greek one, because she is an expert in the Orthodox niptic and hesychastic terminology, and edited this publication. Thanks are due to the Holy Monastery of the Birth of the Theotokos of the Thebes and Levadia diocese, which undertook the publication. It would be an omission if I did not thank Father Nicholas Pallas, priest in the Holy Church of Dormition, Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, for the love he has for Orthodox niptic books and for his zeal in distributing this book also. I pray that St. Gregory Palamas, this great hesychast father, who in his amazing strength and wisdom expanded on the Orthodox theological frameworks of hesychism, may become the guide of all Christians who, living in the West, they turn to the East, they seek Orthodoxy, and who most of all are led toward the East of the East, which is Christ, as he is experienced and interpreted authentically in the Orthodox Church. Written in the Bishopric of Nafpaktos on June 22nd, 1997, on the Sunday of All Saints. Signed, Metropolitan of Nafpaktos, Hierotheos. Introduction. Many discerning fathers have discovered that the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas is quite contemporary. Contemporary man, characterized by anthropocentrism and conjecture, should study and listen to the teaching of St. Gregory, defender of the theologians and herald of divine grace, a man who saw God. St. Gregory is the theologian of the uncreated light. His teaching is quite timely now because Barlamism is alive in many aspects of our life. Hesychism, or the hesychastic life, which is entirely traditional and forms the backbone of Orthodox life, is being undervalued, not to say opposed. It is true that at many points we are seeing an improvement over former times, but there is still the underlying problem of anti-hesychism. One hears a great amount of conjecture and human dialectics. Yet I have observed that amid so many analyses of the saints' teachings, one important aspect has not received attention, that St. Gregory was a Hagiorite, and that in his teaching he expressed the life which he met on the Holy Mountain. I do not believe that the Holy Mountain is something different from the Church, and I am firmly convinced that on the Holy Mountain, as well as in every monastery living in the Orthodox tradition, the Church's therapeutic, traditional way of life is still going on. On the Holy Mountain, we see how the early Christians lived and how the apostolic churches were organized. St. Gregory was already living the life of the Holy Mountain from his childhood, being brought up by his holy parents and in close contact with the teachers and spiritual fathers who came from the Holy Mountain. Afterwards, he lived on the Holy Mountain for many years and rose to great spiritual stature. As a Hagiorite, he confronted the heresy of Balaam and Hagiorite. He guided the flock in Thessaloniki as a true monk of the Holy Mountain. And his death was glorious. Like many Hagiorite fathers, he had foreknowledge of the time of his soul's departure from his body. But the signs that he was recognized by God are those which we also find in many Hagiorite fathers. Therefore, I believe that the subject, St. Gregory Palamas, as a Hagiorite, it deserves special attention, and we should notice particularly the way of life that is being preserved and cherished on the Holy Mountain. This way is the deepest essence of our tradition. This book is a fruit of about 25 years' study. Ever since my student days, I've been reading nearly all the works of St. Gregory Palamas, as well as various books that analyze his life and teaching. I am grateful to Professor Panagiotis Christou at the Theological School of the University of Thessaloniki because it was he who introduced me to the theology of St. Gregory Palamas and guided me in the study of the works of this great Hagiorite hesychist saint. I am grateful to him for having included me in a small group of students who, because we had attended special classes in paleography, were put to work under his personal guidance one summer in the monastery libraries on the Holy Mountain, listing and describing the existing manuscripts. Thus, apart from the fact that this professor is an outstanding petrologist, he's at the same time a great teacher who introduced us to the thought and life of the Fathers. Indeed, we owe grateful thanks to this professor for making the great personality known, for with his staff of co-workers, he has devoted himself to the publication of St. Gregory's unpublished works, and thereby made a great contribution to the revival of theological writings and of Orthodox life. When he turned over to me, then a third-year student, the work of tracing the passages of St. Gregory the theologian, used by St. Gregory Palamas in his texts, as part of the preparation of the second volume of his collected works, I was impelled at the young age toward the study of these two great fathers. I remember with great feeling the trials and dangers of a tempestuous sea one time when in the winter of 1966, with a theologian who is today a university professor, we went to the Holy Mountain to find a manuscript of St. Gregory's. I regard it as a special blessing and an action symbolic for the subsequent pursuit of his life in his texts and works. I must mention further the importance and value of Professor John Romanides for the Orthodox understanding of the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas. In his study, published as an introduction to his book, quote, Greeks and Greek Fathers of the Church, Volume 1, he analyzes in depth the orthodox preconditions for interpreting the works of St. Gregory Palamas, and he also criticizes the contemporary interpretations which have been put forward about the dialogue between St. Gregory and Barlaam. The 13 chapters deal with many aspects of the life and teaching of St. Gregory Palamas. We can see the saint as a hesychast, as a theologian, as a pastor, as a fighter against the heresies, as a sociologist, a great Hagiorite, who is theologizing, teaching, guiding his flock, opposing the heresies. Some repetitions in the chapters were unavoidable and necessary because of the connections between topics. I feel the need to seek St. Gregory Palamas' blessing. I feel him to be my patron saint. I beg him to intercede with God for me and for all my brothers. May God grant, through the entreaties of the saint, that we may acquire this traditional way of life, which is the only path to our cure and deification. God grant that we may follow this path and turn away from the impasse of other roads that are being opened by contemporary machines, which in reality are alienating and worrying man, with the direct result that the whole of society is worried. Written in Athens, 29th August 1991, on the feast of the beheading of John the Baptist, forerunner of the Lord and of the monks. Signed Archimandrite Hierotheos S. Vlachos. Chapter 1. The importance of the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas. In our days there are many editions of the works of St. Gregory Palamas, as well as many studies relating to his life and teaching. This is God's special blessing to our time, for although St. Gregory lived in the 14th century, he has a great deal to say to our time, because as we know, the same philosophical, theological, and even social currents which prevailed in his epoch also predominate in our own. The 14th century has features in common with the 20th. That is why the discussion which went on between St. Gregory Palamas and the philosophers of that time are of considerable interest now. He has much to teach contemporary man. We shall be able to establish the great importance of St. Gregory Palamas for orthodoxy, that is, for the triumph of the true faith, in monasticism and on the Holy Mountain. 1. For orthodoxy. We can see quite clearly the great significance of his teaching for orthodoxy on the important question of epistemology. When we say epistemology, we mean the knowledge of God. And to be precise, we mean the way which we pursue in order to attain knowledge of God. The situation in St. Gregory's time was that orthodoxy was being debased. It was becoming worldly and being changed into either pantheism or agnosticism. Pantheism believed and taught that God in his essence was to be found in all nature, and so when we look at nature, we can acquire knowledge of God. Gnosticism believed and taught that it was utterly impossible for us to know God, just because he is God, and man is limited, and therefore man was completely incapable of attaining a real knowledge of God. In the face of this great danger, St. Gregory Palamas developed the fundamental teaching of the Church concerning the great mystery of the indivisible distinction between the essence and energy of God. We must underline that this is not the teaching of St. Gregory Palamas alone, but of the Orthodox Church, and therefore this theology cannot be called Palamism. Many fathers have referred to the distinction between essence and energy. We find it in the Bible, in the first apostolic fathers, in the Cappadocian fathers, and especially in Basil the Great and that great dogmatic theologian of the Church, St. John of Damascus. St. Gregory Palamas, with his outstanding theological ability, developed further this already existing teaching and put forward its practical consequences and dimensions. It is very characteristic that this distinction began to be noted in discussions about the Holy Spirit. The Calabrian philosopher Barlaam maintained that we could not just know what the Holy Spirit is, especially his procession and his being sent by the Son. In the face of the danger of agnosticism, St. Gregory Palamas taught that the actual procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father is a different thing from his being sent by the Son. Thus, while we do not know the essence of the Holy Spirit, we do know his energy. All spiritual life is a result and fruit of the energy of the Holy Spirit. Therefore, the saint taught, we cannot participate in God's essence, but we can know and participate in his energies. As the great dogmatic theologian St. John of Damascus teaches, we can see his three unions: union in essence of the persons of the Holy Trinity, union in substance in the person of Christ, the theanthropos, between the divine and human nature, and union in energy between God and man. In this way, St. Gregory preserves the true teaching of the Church. If in the time of Athanasius the Great, men doubted the divinity of Christ, in St. Gregory's time they had doubts about God's energies. They said that his energies are created. Therefore, in the dismissal hymn of the saint, we sing, Illuminator of Orthodoxy, supporter and teacher of the Church, spiritual beauty of the monastics, irrefutable champion of the theologians. 2. For monasticism. The teaching of St. Gregory Palamas, Archbishop of Thessaloniki, has great significance for monasticism as well. In the dismissal hymn referred to above, we sing, quote, spiritual beauty of the monastics. In his time, the philosophers, led by Barlaam, doubted the value of traditional monasticism and the monk's way of life, especially that of the so-called hesychasts. This was due to a difference of theological assumptions. Barlaam maintained that the noblest part of man, through the help of which he can acquire knowledge of God, is reason, and that reason is the only instrument by which one can attain knowledge of God. So he came to the conclusion that the ancient Greek philosophers who used a great deal of reasoning attained a greater knowledge of God than the prophets, who were looking at external things, revelations and visions. He laid great stress on the value of the philosophers as against the prophets, the value of human thought as against the vision of the uncreated light, which the three apostles had on Mount Tabor. Well, this naturally had implications for Orthodox and traditional monasticism. If Barlaam's teaching was right and succeeded in prevailing in the Church, priority would be given to reason and philosophy. Traditional monasticism would be disregarded, and we would arrive at agnosticism. But St. Gregory showed in his teaching that the prophets and apostles were higher than the philosophers, that the instrument for acquiring knowledge of God is not reason, but the heart, in its full biblical meaning, that God is not discovered through human reasoning, but reveals himself in a man's heart, and that the real way of knowing God is the hesychastic way, which is described in the Holy Scripture and experienced by all the saints. So he made very clear that the monk's way of life, that is to say, the method of prayer which they were following, leads to true knowledge of God. It is characteristic that one of St. Gregory's first writings, which is also his main work and bears the title On the Holy Hesychasts, refers to the three basic topics which were being pondered at the time. One is the great subject of education, which confronts the question of whether the philosophers are higher than the prophets, and whether philosophy is the real road to the knowledge of God. The second is the theme of noetic prayer, and deals with everything connected with that, while the third is the subject of the uncreated light. The crucial theological view is expounded that the light which the saints see is uncreated. That is to say, it is not a matter of creation, but of the uncreated energy of God. The basis of this writing is traditional Orthodox monasticism, and so it is entitled, quote, On the Holy Hesychasts. Thus we see the great importance of St. Gregory's teaching for Orthodox monasticism. 3. For the Holy Mountain. At the same time, St. Gregory's teaching has great importance for the Holy Mountain, for he himself was a Hagiorite. He lived on the Holy Mountain, experienced its life, and then expressed it. Through his writings, he showed that the Holy Mountain is a place of life and above all, a way of life. The Holy Mountain expresses the Orthodox tradition. It is an expression of the life which exists in the Orthodox Church. As we shall see in what follows, St. Gregory went to the Holy Mountain as a student and a lay brother, not as a teacher. He went in order to study his Orthodox tradition. Day and night he prayed to God, crying, "Lighten my darkness." He put himself under obedience to confessors and deified monks. He gained many experiences of the spiritual life. He attained a high degree of holiness. He kept silence for many years, and when he was required to speak, he spoke and expressed his experience. Therefore, his teaching is an expression of the life of the Holy Mountain, but in a wider sense, it is an expression of the life of the Church, because the Holy Mountain is not absolute or autonomous. The Holy Mountain expresses the life of the Orthodox Church. Thus we can see its great importance. We said at the beginning that the time of St. Gregory Palamas is parallel to our own time. This is very important, and we want to emphasize it particularly. In the first place, we see that men's search for God is increasing day by day. Many people are seeking to find and possess real knowledge of God. Some, since they are not following the true way to knowing God, become discouraged and come to deny God. Others, instead of finding the true God, find various idols of God which they worship. Consequently, idolatry is prevalent even in our time. Then we notice that even among Orthodox Christians there are two great trends. People are divided into two large categories. The first category includes those who can rightly be called followers of Balaam, who give priority to reason and depend mainly on man. They believe that in this way they'll solve many problems, including, of course, the first and principal one, which is the knowledge of God. The second category includes those who, like St. Gregory Palamas, have their heart at the center of their spiritual life. The heart, in the full sense given to the word by the biblical patristic tradition. They followed the method which had been followed by all the saints of the Church. They have been counted worthy of attaining a true knowledge of God and, of course, true communion with God. Thus today there are two large streams, two ways of life, and since the Church recognizes St. Gregory Palamas as a great theologian, and his teaching is the teaching of the Church, we are called to walk this path. All that follows will present the life and teaching of the saint, the true way of life and St. Gregory's theology, which is in reality is the Church's theology. When we follow the teaching of St. Gregory, we shall solve many existential problems which are troubling us. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. On the Holy Mountain. The witness of the saints is not intellectual or conjectural, but empirical. The saints speak from their own personal experience. Because they have freed their nous from captivity to reasoning, passions, and environmental conditions, the nous has been illuminated by divine grace and guided to the vision of God. Then they have been attested to be true theologians in the Church. They have spoken of God because they have attained the vision of God. St. Gregory Palamas, Archbishop of Thessaloniki, belongs to this category. His teaching presents the essence of the Orthodox tradition, which is the hesychastic way of life. In fact, what is called hesychism is the basis of all the ecumenical councils, as well as the main characteristic mark of the great fathers of the Church. If we look at the Holy Fathers apart from the atmosphere of Orthodox hesychia, we will do them an injustice. I noticed that the contemporary theological movement is in a state of contradiction. On the one hand, a great deal is being said about the Holy Fathers, and marks of their teaching appear in our efforts to support our own thoughts, while on the other hand we reject the method used by the Holy Fathers to reach the point where they could speak of God in an unerring and divinely inspired way. Therefore, we must give serious attention to the way in which the saints spoke of God. This is precisely the purpose of the present chapter. We shall examine the life of St. Gregory on the Holy Mountain. We shall see him at work in the garden of the Panagia. This is very important because it will be seen that the saint was not a conjecturing or cerebral philosopher, but a great father who acquired experience of the spiritual life and attained deification, which, as he himself said, is the same as vision of the uncreated light. The quotations are from the biography written by his friend and fellow monk, St. Hierotheos Kokkinos. This biography by a saint has many elements of authenticity. Chapter 2 on the Holy Mountain continued. 1. His life before he moved to the Holy Mountain. St. Gregory had the great blessing from God that he lived the Hagioritic life, which is the Orthodox life itself, even before he visited the Holy Mountain and became a monk there. He had already been prepared from an early age before going to the Holy Mountain, where he developed the life which he had previously been living. This preparatory instruction can be looked at with reference to 3 factors. 1. The atmosphere prevailing in Constantinople at that time. 2. The life of his devout parents. And 3. The education which he received. Let us analyze these 3 factors. In Constantinople at the time of St. Gregory, there was a favorable climate for living the Orthodox tradition. Major contributions to this were the contact with the Holy Mountain and the monasteries that existed in the city and its surroundings, and the teaching of St. Simeon, the new theologian, who brought a revolution to his time by putting hesychasm forward as the way par excellence of a personal approach to God. St. Hierotheos Kokkinos, Patriarch of Constantinople, describes this situation. He says that Constantinople had accepted ancient wisdom after purifying it of atheism, myths, and babblings, and adorned that wisdom with the truth and the faith in one God in 3 persons, as well as the cross, and the simplicity of the gospel, and thus showed itself to be, quote, a grateful servant of the true and original wisdom, end quote, St. Hierotheos Kokkinos. Thus, the capital showed itself to be the city of the wisdom of God. Here, the distinction is made between the first and second wisdoms. And as we know, the first wisdom is man's communion with God. As we study the works of St. Gregory Palamas, we can well appreciate what St. Hierotheos means when he characterizes the truth of the gospel as original and true wisdom. The hesychastic climate which prevailed then in Constantinople can be seen in the atmosphere that existed in his family surroundings. In studying the life of St. Gregory Palamas' parents, as well as the way in which they brought him up, we can perceive the influence of the Holy Mountain on the life of the city, as well as on the Orthodox senses of its inhabitants. St. Gregory's father was a nobleman and member of the imperial senate. Indeed, he was chosen to teach the emperor's grandson, especially to mold his character and give him spiritual instruction. He was a teacher not only of the emperor's grandson, but also of the emperor himself. Thus he was engaged to, quote, teach virtue and to be a good counselor, spiritual instructor, and guide. At moments when the emperor was overcome with wrath, St. Gregory's father calmed him. The emperor liked him better than anyone else, even than his own blood relations, quote, because of the purity of his soul and his way of looking only toward the good and toward God. Constantine, St. Gregory's father, lived the hesychastic life in all its fullness. Therefore, although he was in a palace and meeting with a great many people every day, quote, his noetic sobriety was such that he came back to himself and to God through nipsis, attention, and prayer, end of quote. He lived in constant watchfulness and prayer. This was also noticed by other people, for it is well known from the patristic tradition that when the nous is detached from reasoning and is illuminated, a person is able to live in the world with its various troubles and still have unceasing prayer. Married people, as well, are able to live that life, as we see here in St. Gregory Palamas' father. Living in this way, he saw to it that not only he himself had frequent contact with holy people, ascetics, and monks, but that his children too from early childhood associated with such spiritual men. He understood that training is effective when the parents link their children with the church, and particularly with people who express the life of the church. He brought his whole family to the hermits, not only the robust older children, quote, but also the immature ones who were just beginning to speak and to understand what was being said to them, end of quote. Quoting from St. Philotheus Kokinos' bios of Gregory Palamas. To continue. As soon as they were born, he linked the children with holy persons because he believed that in this way they could be shaped in a loving relationship with God. In fact, there is a description of one such journey to their spiritual father, who lived in solitary stillness at the monastery across the sea, above Galata. Before leaving this world, his father was tonsured a monk, quote, a way of life and conduct into which he was not uninitiated, end of quote. This is quite characteristic because it shows that Constantine, although married and the father of many children, was not different from the monks. His way of life was purely monastic. He had the same tradition, which was and is, in reality, the life of the gospel. Certainly, his monastic way of life can be seen during the last moments of his life, when his wife, St. Gregory's mother, approached and urged him before he died to ask the emperor to take the children under his protection out of friendship and respect. He did not consent to this, but looking toward the icon of the Theotokos, said, quote, I leave my children not to these earthly and partial rulers, but to this queen of all, the mother of the kingdom of heaven, end quote. This incident alone demonstrates his inner wealth and his monastic perception, as well as his ascetic way of life. He dedicated his children to the protection of the Theotokos. St. Gregory was the eldest of the children and 7 years old at the time. But his mother likewise wanted to become a nun, which means that she too had the same way of life as her husband. However, after asking the advice of spiritual counselors, she postponed being tonsured to the monastic life. Thus, St. Gregory grew up in an environment which breathed the monastic way of life, linked with spiritual fathers from an early age and having saintly parents who kept the regimen of the monks. He had received the first necessary equipment for developing still further later on. What St. Philotheus said is very significant, that when Gregory and his brothers were seen in the palace, the higher and lower functionaries said, quote, these are the saints' children. Added to these two factors in the godly guidance of St. Gregory Palamas was the whole education which he received from childhood. In the first place, as we've said before, he was entrusted by his father to the protection of the Theotokos, and she accepted him and protected him throughout his life. The Theotokos proved to be a wonderful godmother to him. The protection was at such a depth that before he began to study, he would kneel 3 times before the icon of the Theotokos and say a prayer. When he did this, he was able to keep in mind what he read. But if he ever forgot to say this prayer, he could not repeat and recite what he'd studied. This was a clear sign of the protection of the Panagia. It also shows the way in which St. Gregory was educated. Indeed, the Panagia persuaded the emperor to take the godly Gregory under his supervision in the palace and to see to all that he needed for his education. But the saint was nurtured further in spiritual wisdom. In his adolescent years, the desire for monastic life developed in him. He did not rely on himself alone, but approached and asked discriminating spiritual fathers, particularly those who came from the Holy Mountain. The saint had learned from an early age, following the example of his Holy Father, and his Holy Mother as well, to make contact with Hagioritic fathers who experienced God personally. His biographer, he writes, quote, therefore he preferred to put himself under distinguished fathers and teachers of virtue, and especially among the most outstanding and distinguished ones who came down from holy Athos, end quote. They suggested that he become a monk, give up the world with all its attractions, take up the cross of Christ and, quote, walk straight to the desert and the venerable mountain. At the same time, they advised him that if it was difficult for the present suddenly to go this way of the cross, he should live an ascetic life from that moment. Quote, but you must meanwhile take up frugality in everything and bodily suffering and hard training before the other things. Here we see the traditional training which St. Gregory received from those ascetics. First of all, he confides his longing to those who can distinguish between the uncreated and the created. Then they give him traditional training. If they advised him to remain in the world because he had obligation to his mother and his younger brothers, if they had advised him to live in a counterfeit and a cheap way, as unfortunately is done nowadays, then perhaps we would not have had a St. Gregory Palamas. However, they guided him through the hard ascetic life of the gospel, which is the traditional instruction par excellence. Among these spiritual fathers was Theologian, Bishop of Philadelphia, who lived many years in the stillness of the Holy Mountain and then was made a bishop of the Church of Christ, which shows the Orthodox way of electing someone to the leadership of the Church. He proved to be the best spiritual father for the divine Gregory and guided him in the Hagioritic Orthodox tradition. Therefore, even before he even went to the Holy Mountain, Gregory was being prepared for this angelic way of life. For St. Gregory, Theologian of Philadelphia became, quote, more of a father and an imitator than the best of fathers, and was initiated wonderfully by him into the habit of holy sobriety and noetic prayer, while he was still living in the noisy world, end quote. Thus the divine Gregory lived in ascetic sobriety and acquired noetic prayer at a relatively young age, before he was 20, and while he was still living in the world with all its noise and all its bustle. This is the training with which the Holy Fathers instruct their spiritual children. They are not satisfied with a moralistic training, but initiate them into noetic prayer and holy watchfulness. However, St. Gregory also showed himself to be very obedient. He was not content just to ask questions of the spiritual fathers, but he obeyed their advice. Thus he proved to be, quote, a bird that cuts straight through the air, end of quote. He practiced self-control and frugality, for he was well aware that no one can go on to illumination of his nous unless his heart has been purified. He lived ascetically as to dress, shoes, bedding, fasting, and vigil. He did away not only with tasty foods, but also with sleep, especially in the morning. He ate only a little bread and drank a little water, which was necessary to maintain his condition. He was ascetic to such a degree that some people thought he was mad. Struggling in this way while still living in Constantinople, the saint proved to be above nature, and while in the prime of life and in the midst of the world and its materials, he overcame both the desire and rebellion of the flesh that comes with adolescence, and all these things to such a degree that some people thought him to be superhuman. Before going to Mount Athos, the saint had acquired ascetic experiences. He had received the grace of the Holy Spirit. On his way to the Holy Mountain, he came to Papikio Mountain between Thrace and Macedonia, where many monks were living ascetically. St. Hierotheos says that this was the work of divine providence, to show them, quote, the wise Gregory and the divine grace overshadowing him. The divine Gregory truly seemed to those monks to be really great and wonderful, and so deep in word and character and posture and gait and attention and thoughtfulness, that all who saw him were surprised to find that they were looking at such an old solitary and philosopher in word, deed, and thought, in an immature and youthful body. Before the age of 20, St. Gregory was a living habitation of God, full of the Spirit, quote, a wrestler and friend of holy prayer. At Papicio mountain he came into dialogue with the Messalinians, or those who call themselves Euchites, whose erroneous ideas he overthrew, including their ideas about the value of prayer. There, too, he explained the teaching that the cross of Christ was active also in the Old Testament prophets. By this conversation, St. Gregory stopped their mouths and cut off their talkativeness, and proved to be the best conqueror and general. Many of them, understanding that St. Gregory's words were God-inspired, visited Constantinople, and after confessing their error in the church, became its members. In this period of his life, through a certain incident which took place, the heretics, they wanted to poison him, and the saint understood their device right away. Quote, "The man's discernment became clear to all the others," end quote. From an early age, the divine Gregory knew the hesychastic life of the Church, noetic prayer, and he also had the gift of discernment. Hagiorite fathers living in Constantinople had suitably prepared him for his approach to the Holy Mountain and for reaching a great height of spiritual life. So the atmosphere which prevailed in Constantinople, the orthodox climate of his family, and the traditional education which he received from holy teachers placed him in the current of the spotless tradition and made him a Hagiorite even before he visited the Holy Mountain. 2. His life on the Holy Mountain. In obedience to his spiritual fathers, who saw his inner longing and advised him accordingly, he went to the Holy Mountain. He wanted to know the life of the Holy Mountain at close hand and to be initiated into its inner spiritual life. He arrived at the Lavra, which was close to Vatopedi Monastery, and went to a monk by the name of Nicodemus, quote, "a man wonderful in deed and in the vision of God, and very well known to all the Hagiorites. Nicodemus was living the hesychastic life. Gregory made himself obedient to him and received from him the monastic habit. In the first years of his monastic life, he was severely ascetic. He lived in fasting and vigil, with watchfulness and unceasing prayer. At the same time, he constantly called on the Virgin Mary to intercede for him with God. His prayer was unceasing. He constantly repeated, 'Enlighten my darkness.' After 2 years of hard ascetic practice, he had a great experience. While he was living hesychastically, that is to say, alone, in silent attention to himself and God, John the Evangelist appeared to him, not in sleep, but in a vision, and told him that he had been sent by the Theotokos to find out why he was praying to God night and day, saying, 'Enlighten my darkness.' Gregory replied that, passionate as he was asking God to enlighten him so that he might know and do his will for salvation. Then John the Evangelist gave him the message of the Mother of God, 'I myself will be your helper.' It is important to say that this experience was not a dream, but a vision, theoria, and we know that there is an enormous difference between the two. It might also be said that this happened at the moment when Gregory had turned his prayer to himself and to God. It is surely well known that this is what the Fathers called the circular motion of the nous, when the nous, suitably trained, turns to the heart and from there rises to God. For 3 years he remained in obedience to the great spiritual father Nicodemus. After the glorious falling asleep of his spiritual father, he went to practice asceticism at the great Lavra. He was there for 3 years, and here too he earned amazement by his conduct and his philosophy. When St. Hierotheos writes that the fathers there marveled at his philosophy, he means by this term the wisdom of God which he had acquired through asceticism and training in Orthodox hesychia. The Fathers found that the reality was greater than his reputation. There he lived a full life of virtue, deed and word, the general and the particular, and they contended that he did all these things to excess. His soul proved to be a combination and abode of everything good. The saint mastered not only his appetites and irrational passions, but even the natural and necessary things. Indeed, it is said that he went 3 months without sleep, except for a little at midday after eating, lest his brain should suffer any ill effects from the lack of sleep. These things show the great value of Christian asceticism, that even the body should be ascetic, since it too is granted to receive divine grace. Theology is not the result and fruit of intellectual knowledge, but the fruit of personal experience, which is a result of great struggle and sacrifice. For 3 years he practiced asceticism at the Lavra as well. There he went to Glossia, the holy place of the anchorites, where beloved Hezekiah prevailed. That is to say, after the prescribed struggle, he came to a more hesychastic place, better prepared for the great ascesis. There, in the company of holy hesychasts, Gregory discovered the finest and highest mysteries of the energy of the nous and the greatest and first vision of God. This means that his nous had detached itself from reasoning, the passions, and the surrounding world, and had entered his heart, and risen from there to the vision theoria of God. There the saint offered, quote, unceasing noetic prayer in spirit and worship. His extreme humility, sincere love for God and neighbor, compunction and mourning were fruits of this prayer and vision of God. Tears were constantly flowing from his eyes, and in this way he attained a depth of love for God such as only a few have experienced, and is credible only to those who have the same experience. He stayed 2 years in the solitude of Glossia. However, bandit raids forced him to leave that hesychastic place and go to Thessaloniki with his disciples and fellow monks. He stayed in Thessaloniki only a short while, because his purpose was to proceed to Jerusalem. However, as a good Hagiorite, he sought enlightenment from God as to whether the journey should take place, his biographer notes. God revealed to him in a vision that he should not make his journey to Jerusalem, but should remain there. While in Thessaloniki, he received the gift of ordination. Again, through a revelation, he advanced to the degree of a priest. He confronted this great matter as a Hagiorite. Quote, he accepted the divine and holy things in a divine and holy way. His preparation in Constantinople and on the Holy Mountain, but also the blessing of God, made him a priest of the God Most High. After the ordination, he went with his disciples to Veroi. There he established a frontisterion of divine philosophy. Frontisterion being a place established for learning and practicing hesychism. To continue, he lived in deep hesychism. Throughout the week, he did not go out, and he received absolutely no one for conversation. In other words, he remained alone, praying to God. Only on Saturday and Sunday did he come out to celebrate the divine Eucharist and to guide his spiritual brothers. In this period, he passed the 30th year of his age. His asceticism was extreme because he was physically healthy and relatively young. He constantly exhausted his body with fasting and vigil, trying to make it completely subject to his soul. By self-control and watchfulness, he purified and refined the eye of his soul, which is the nous, and thus through unceasing prayer he lifted his nous to God and united it with him. To be sure, this does not happen in a day by a man's ascetic effort, but asceticism is essential as an expression of the person's will in order for this community and oneness to succeed, and then comes the divine grace through which this union is achieved. For the nous cannot be united with the heart and attain to vision of God without divine grace. As the saint was living such a life, the fruits of the Spirit were abundant in him. All were astonished by the action, but also by the words of the saint. All regarded his life as a miracle beyond this generation, and all regarded him as more than human. The grace that was in his soul passed into his body as well. Thus the great asceticism which he had practiced did not end in the attrition of his body, but in its transformation. According to his biographer, the saint was washed with extraordinary streams of tears, and his face was supernaturally radiant and altered when he came out of stillness or from the divine liturgy. After 5 years, because of the invasion of the Illyrians or Albanians, he was obliged to return to the great laver of the Holy Mountain. Thus he came back to the Holy Mountain to continue his struggle. He did not stay in the monastery, but in a cell outside it. He was in communication with the brothers when there was a vigil or liturgy, and the rest of the time he remained alone in constant prayer to God. He was, quote, alone with God in utter silence, neither coming out of his hut in any way nor entering into conversation or being seen by anyone. Only on Saturdays and Sundays could he be seen by others. St. Gregory surpassed many in active asceticism, but it was also aiming at theoria, the vision of God, at direct union and illumination and deification, at extreme love and likeness to God, at high and faultless knowledge of God, through unceasing prayer and noetic hesychia and humility and mourning. The saint was well aware that the active life is not enough. For if the vision of God is not pursued, a person is corrupted, and there is a great danger for his attaining pharisaical righteousness. Then his biographer, St. Hierotheos presents a lengthy extract from the works of St. Gregory Palamas, which shows the path that one must follow in order to attain deification and personal communion with God. He cites it because here St. Gregory is speaking from experience and showing exactly what he did in order to attain communion with God and therefore knowledge of God. I shall give a small summary of this text because I consider it important, since it shows what methods we should follow in order to be cured and attain deification. This is the trodden path of the saints, and it must be underlined, because unfortunately many of us attempt to open other paths with our own philosophical and psychological theories. But the way of the saints is the safest and surest. According to St. Gregory, the nous should detach itself from things outside, from being diffused in the world, and should return to the heart. No sooner is it back than it will see the, quote, dreadful mask which has come from its wandering below. Seeing this ugliness, it sorrowfully undertakes to purify it. When it has removed this ugly mask, the mask of the superficial man, the nous comes into his heart, and there he prays unceasing to God in secret. Thus he acquires a noetic prayer. Then God gives him the gift called peace of thoughts, a peace which brings him humility, which is the cohesive of all virtue. From peace of thoughts and humility proceed all the other virtues, at the center of which is found love. On the threshold of these is the preface to the age to come, with the blossoming of ineffable and inalienable joy. Poverty is the mother of freedom from anxiety, and freedom from anxiety is the mother of attention and prayer. And these two give birth to mourning and tears. Tears purify the whole content of the horrible mask. It is only then that the path of virtue becomes easier and the conscience blameless. And from there comes the most perfect joy. And the weeping is changed from anguished to most sweet, and prayer is changed to thanksgiving. All these things thus far are gifts of betrothal, of a pledge. The nous liberated after this ascetic effort, surpassing reason and all things intelligible and the imagination, presents itself deaf and speechless to God and is illuminated. The person whose nous attains illumination becomes a natural one, entering into his true way of life and ascending to the eternal mountains. And what a marvel meets his view! Without being separated from matter, he ascends by the unutterable power of the Spirit, and thus, quote, hears unutterable words and sees the invisible. And thereafter he can be and is completely held in wonder, even if he is away from there, and vying with the untiring singers of praises, he becomes another true angel of God on earth, end quote. At that time, the nous attains the vision of the uncreated light. To be sure, St. Gregory says that the light is everywhere, but it does not shine in the same way on all. It is seen according to the person's purity of heart and according to the will of God who gives light. In any case, when a man's nous is illuminated, then it conveys many samples of divine beauty to the attached body. Also, coming from the vision of the uncreated light is the habit of virtue, as well as inability or difficulty to move toward evil. From that comes the word of theology, man's gift of miracles, prophecy, and clairvoyance. Above all, the person then possesses knowledge of the future. The great benefit of this training is to return of the nous to itself, the return of all the soul's powers to the nous, and of God's energy to the nous, by which the person comes back to that ancient and indescribable beauty. This fragment seems to contain not only the way which he himself pursued in order to reach deification and faultless theology, but also the path which all the Orthodox follow in order to be cured and saved. Furthermore, it shows the way to our own cure. This alone is the Orthodox path of man's cure. And if we read this passage carefully, as well as all other related works of the saint, we shall see that no contemporary philosophy or psychology which suggests other anti-traditional ways of healing can find support here. No modern psychoanalysis can be mirrored in these words of St. Gregory. For St. Gregory shows us a way precisely opposite to that of humanistic psychotherapy. St. Hierotheos, presenting St. Gregory Palamas' journey toward deification, and especially referring to the description he gave of this journey, says that these words are not words of human wisdom, but of the godlike Hagiorite saint, quote, of that godlike and heavenly nous, and that divine and truly wise tongue. After St. Gregory attained illumination of his nous, as well as deification, it was to be expected that he would see visions in the light. During the vigil in the Lavra, quote, withdrawing his nous even from hymn singing, he usually turned it toward himself and through himself to God. And at once the divine light from above shone round him, illuminating with those rays the eyes of both his body and his soul. And he saw things that were to happen many years later. He saw Abbot Macarius of the Lavra clothed in the bishop's stole, and Macarius later did really become Archbishop of Thessaloniki. In another theoria, he saw the Mother of God herself assuming his protection, that is to say, arranging for all his needs, so that he and his companions might devote themselves to inner hesychastic life. Likewise, during noetic hesychia and prayer, and when the shadow of sleep came over him, he saw a vision of God which showed him that he had been given the gift of theology, and should make other people as well sharers of his words. And thus, guided by that vision, but especially by the Holy Spirit, who also was dwelling within him, he wrote various homilies. The first was about the Holy Father Peter, founder of the Holy Mountain. The second homily was on the entrance of the Mother of God, and revealed the whole hesychastic life which the saint was living at that time. Afterwards, he was chosen abbot at the holy monastery of Esphigimenu on the Holy Mountain. The light had been placed on the lampstand. Here he manifested all his great gifts. St. Hierotheos lists his excellent qualities, and as one reads them, one understands that they mirror the Athonite way of life. St. Gregory was simple in his way of life, free in his judgment, sweet in converse, humble and approachable to those who were earnest and humble, lofty and unyielding to the slothful and scornful, forgiving to those who sincerely turned away from sin, he himself daily inspiring the turning away and repentance by his great number of deeds and words. He taught the monks with the golden rushing stream of his words, and he carefully saw to the good order of the sanctuary. His monks loved him so much that when he left the leadership of the monastery, they did not want to remain in that monastery. Quote, but they scattered, some into stillness and retreat, others into stricter submission and asceticism, others into utmost solitude, since they could not remain with the saint forever. At his Phigimenu monastery he also performed miracles, which showed that the grace of God dwelt richly in his heart. But he constantly longed for hesychia, for stillness. Therefore he gave up the position of abbot, went back to the frontisterion at the Lavra, where he occupied himself with his beloved hesychia. During this period, the heretic Barlaam appeared in Thessaloniki and began to teach untraditional and unorthodox theories. The saint's struggles against the heretic Barlaam began at that time. Gregory had long been prepared by divine grace. Now he was fully ready to face Barlaam's humanist ideas. Barlaam maintained that one could reach God through philosophy and conjecture, while St Gregory Palamas, having experienced the actual road that leads to knowledge of God, upheld the orthodox view that it is only through purity that one can see God. It is not my intention to tell the whole story of his life. Moreover, the title of this chapter is Practicing Asceticism on the Holy Mountain. Of the whole story of his battle with Barlaam, I shall mention only those elements which show his hesychastic life, but also the fruits of his ascetic practice on the Holy Mountain. 3. Hesychastic aspects of his struggles. When the new heresy presented itself, which, if it prevailed, would lead the Church into agnosticism, the task of opposing it was entrusted to St. Gregory Palamas. For they recognized in him a capable and faithful child of the Church, who had the necessary spiritual experiences to take on this difficult task. Barlaam had approached simple monks in order to see how they prayed. His aim, though, was not to learn about noetic prayer and the vision of the uncreated light, but to slander the monks and attack hesychism. Thus, quote, alas, he attacked the teachers and their holy science, which was their prayer to God and the mystical vision of God, shamelessly calling heretical the very mystagogues and supervisors of the holy things, end quote. When St. Gregory learned what Barlaam was teaching, he recognized the heresy at once, with his experience of distinguishing the created from the uncreated, the spirit of fallacy from the spirit of truth. He said prophetically, quote, I have learned from our blessed fathers of old that hesychia will invade the Church of Christ, indeed in our generation. I see, unfortunately, that the prediction of those holy men is already coming true. For I think that the serpent, author of evil and creator of such evils, cannot find any other suitable and clever instrument for evil than this. End of quote. At this difficult time for the Church of Christ, Metropolitan Isidorus of Thessaloniki, after consulting with others, decided to summon from his solitude and the holy mountain, quote, the wise Gregory with his theological language and the great wisdom of the Spirit, who by nature and talent and divine grace could, better than anyone else, capably accomplish this task, end quote. They wrote to St. Gregory and urgently entreated him to do this. He was persuaded by their words, and judging that there is a time both for silence and for warfare, left the stillness and the holy mountain and arrived at Thessaloniki against his will and by his will. Against his will because he foresaw the great ordeal for the Church caused by Barlaam's heresy. A true hesychist father, when he found out in Thessaloniki all that Barlaam was saying, he grieved inwardly, was wounded in soul, and by the grace of the Holy Spirit saw clearly how things were developing. He was not content, however, to feel grief on hearing Barlaam's heretical opinions, but he made an effort of reconciliation. He sent messages to Barlaam through various persons and friends that he should stop attacking the hesychist fathers. But Barlaam, possessed by the evil demon, increased his attacks. Then the saint made the effort to meet him personally. In fact, the two men met, and St. Gregory asked him to teach only those things which he had learned, that is to say, things related to philosophy, and not to teach things which he did not know. If he continued to explain hesychism, from his own perspectives, not only would he be seen by the hesychasts to be inglorious and disgraceful, but he would come away in shame and repent in dishonor and without any benefit. Barlaam did not want to hear this conciliatory advice of the saint. It was only then that St. Gregory began to write and answer Barlaam's views. Indeed, he used those classic words spoken by all the Holy Fathers when they took up a struggle on behalf of unblemished faith and the Orthodox truth. Quote, "For I know and am persuaded by the grace of Christ that my struggle and zeal is on behalf of the truth in God, and I would rather be reviled along with my lowly brothers than to have the temporary pleasure of good repute and human glory. And I consider that to be derided along with the brothers living in Christ is greater than the treasures of all the world." End quote. Like another Moses, he led the Orthodox people against the new Pharaoh, the heretic and philosopher Barlaam. The saint endured many things in his life afterwards, but he faced them all with faith in God, forbearance, and patience, especially with perseverance. It was then that he wrote the Triads, the treatise which, when completed later, constituted his familiar work, quote, on defense of the holy hesychasts. The first section of the first triad refers to worldly wisdom and the extent to which the monks should make use of it. In the second section, he develops the theme of the return of the nous to the heart, saying that those who desire orthodox hesychia must take care to keep their nous within the body. And in the third section, he analyzes his, quote, concerning divine light and illumination and holy bliss and perfection in Christ. The other three parts of the second triad have almost the same content, but develop the subjects more exhaustively, and following the written texts of the heretic Barlaam. At this crucial point in the beginning of his struggle, St. Gregory remained in Thessaloniki for 3 years. However, as a hesychast himself, he confronted the fact hesychistically. He did not become too upset. Although he was distressed about the heresy, his heart was possessed by a boundless calm. In Thessaloniki, he tried to live as in the solitude of the holy mountain. A Hagiorite himself in his life, when he came away from the holy mountain, he made the world his cell. He did not lose his own quality. His biographer informs us that while he was teaching and writing, he was spending most of the time, quote, in the company of mourning and solitude and stillness, meeting with God alone as was his custom. And since he did not have his beloved stillness and withdrawal from people, he made a little house for himself, the most inward of all, and free from sounds and noises and people's conversation. There he was withdrawn from everything, and night and day he won, as far as possible, the blessings of solitude. By this behavior, the saint shows us how the struggles for orthodoxy take place. That is to say, we cannot fight by means of our own passions. It is not possible in the name of the struggles for the preservation of the faith to neglect inner peace and stillness. Thus St. Gregory was a Hagiorite throughout his life. Indeed, in one such prayer, during his struggle with Barlaam, while he was praying in stillness, it often happened that divine light suddenly came and shone round. The saint was bathed in the uncreated light. As an obedient and good Hagiorite, he felt the need to go to the Fathers on the holy mountain to renew his struggles for godliness and to receive their personal approval, imitating here, too, the Apostle Paul, the great apostle of the nations. Thus he went to the mountain with Metropolitan Isidore of Thessaloniki, told them about his writings, showed his concern and zeal on behalf of Hezekiah and the vision of God, and recounted the jabberings and blasphemies of the opponents and the methods by which he opposed them. In the end, he requested their common vote and decision about it. He was not acting simply as a Hagiorite, but also as orthodox. For on great matters of faith and worship, the Orthodox accept the experience of the deified. And since on the Holy Mountain, the bastion of orthodoxy, there are always those who have been initiated by experience, their help and approval are needed. This shows us the way to write and speak. We must get confirmation of our own experience. In other words, let illuminated men give us the assurance that we are walking the path of devotion in the right way. And if we do not have our own experience, so much greater is our need for the experience of the deified. The Hagiorite fathers, knowing St Gregory Palamas, but also recognizing him as a genuine theologian and confessor of the faith, commended him and approved and confirmed his writings and his struggles. It was in that period that the Hagiorite fathers approved the famous Hagiorite tome, which was written by the same St Gregory and which played an important and decisive role afterwards in the struggle against the anti-hesychastic philosophers. I shall pass over his other struggles, as well as the affairs relating to the first and second councils which took place in Constantinople and authenticated the teaching of St. Gregory. But I must pause to mention one important event which shows that even while he was in Constantinople, he lived hesychastically as a Hagiorite. For one cannot write and speak about hesychism and let his behavior be anti-hesychastic. When, during the civil war between John Pelagios and John C., Patriarch John changed his mind about hesychism and St. Gregory Palamas and was creating problems, with the result that division was created in his flock. St. Gregory persistently advised peace and concord in all things. But, unfortunately, they did not listen. Then Gregory withdrew at once, and after seeking out a small place near the city to be alone with himself and God in an atmosphere of stillness, like that divine Jeremiah, he bewailed the disobedience and utter destruction of this generation. However, more difficult days for St. Gregory were coming. He was ordered to be put in prison. Thus, alas, the son of light, the brilliant preacher, after many slanderings, was condemned to darkness and imprisoned as a criminal. But how did the saint cope with the situation? How did he live in the dark prison? His biographer, Hierotheos, gives us some particulars. Gregory had spent 4 years shut in prison and had outdone even the prophet Jeremiah himself. His body was sickly and frail and in need of almost daily hospital care and medicines. But this did not worry the saint very much. He was distressed mainly by the double corruption of the human race. On the one hand, there was hostility among the people. On the other hand, the patristic and apostolic reverence for God were being nullified, with the introduction of innovative teachings and mixing them with the pure words of the truth. What distressed the saint most was the fact that all these things were emanating from those who appeared to be protectors and leaders of the church. But as he thought of these things, the saint sometimes spoke David's words, "Let thy mercy, O Lord, be upon us as our hope is in thee," and sometimes the words of St. John Chrysostom, "Glory to thee, O Lord, for all things." He combined his prayer with thanks to God and the surrender of both himself and the Orthodox faith to God. He himself had done what he could. Now God would have to intervene. In all the trials and tribulations he remained unbending and unflinching in everything because of this faith in God, and at the same time he remained unburnt, like the three children in the fiery furnace, praising God perceptibly and intelligibly, and composing excellently the hymn of confession in words and writings. He faced this tribulation with thanksgiving to God and trust in his providence. In parallel, he wrote about the truth of right belief, and he not only was not burnt by the attacks of evil, but meeting them with courage and faith in God, he intelligibly burnt the servants and leaders of false belief. Finding himself in prison, the saint thought that this time was a time for noetic hesychia and perfect devotion to God, and he devoted himself to this night and day. At the same time, studying the works of the Holy Fathers, he wrote and spoke about orthodoxy. This behavior of St. Gregory shows us the best combination of hesychism and action. The action for the defense of orthodoxy and of the mystery of right belief should take place in a hesychastic climate, we cannot speak and write without Hesychia, with all its orthodox content. This is a characteristic mark of all the saints. We find it in St. Maximus the Confessor, who was a hesychastic father at the same time as a confessor of the faith. We find the same thing in Basil the Great, St. Gregory the theologian, and so many other saints. A change in the ecclesiastical and political situation resulted not only in the freeing of the saint from prison, but also in his being consecrated Metropolitan of Thessaloniki to help pacify and purify it from the plague of heresy. Since the zealots of Thessaloniki did not allow him to enter the city, even to be enthroned, the saint went to his beloved holy mountain. There he rested from his great struggles on behalf of his blameless faith and belief. The Hagiorite fathers of Athos received him with great enthusiasm because they had been missing him for such a long time, and thus every day they shared the outpourings of that tongue and wanted to keep him there until harmony and peace prevailed in Thessaloniki. And St. Gregory wished for this also. After some years, the people recognized their error and were eager for the Good Shepherd. They prepared a boat to bring him to the city from Lemnos, where he was at that time. They received him with great enthusiasm and many festive demonstrations. A procession was formed for his reception and enthronement. The singers sang the resurrection troparia. This was not by chance. The people linked the saint with Christ because he had suffered for the faith and for orthodoxy and had descended into the Hades of the prison. It seemed to them that this was just as if they were seeing another Christ in this disciple and imitator of Christ, as if he had come back from Hades and the tomb of the persecutions and exile, and that on that day they were celebrating the bright resurrection. And since the people understood their error, they sought to be purified, singing together, quote, "Let us purify our senses, and we shall behold Christ radiant with the ineffable light of the resurrection." They also sang, "Come, let us quaff a new beverage, and Christ, the fountain of immortality, springing from the tomb. And shine, shine, O New Jerusalem, for the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee." The important thing is that this had no precedent, but happened through the inspiration and energy of divine grace. But as an Athonite, St. Gregory appointed that on the third day there should be a litany with icons, psalm singing, and prayers. The saint went through the greatest part of the city, praying, praising, giving thanks for the past, praying for the future. At the end he spoke of concord and peace and had them all hanging on his words, seriously wounding them, and at once from the first moment he drew their souls to himself and to God in an indescribable way. All hung upon his words, and the souls of his flock were fed by his love for them and for God. But also all those who had previously blamed and reviled him became his friends through his homily. And they became not only his friends, but his servants as well, falling at his feet, kissing them, asking forgiveness for their previous insolence and insult. As a good Athonite, the saint gave them forgiveness and made them his friends. Not only did he give these things to them richly, but he also added the greatest things and enrolled them as his friends and family, and to the end he did not cease to be generous to them in words and goods. In order to purify the people, he was not content with litanies and prayers, but also celebrated the divine liturgy in the cathedral of St. Sophia. Then indeed God too glorified him, for a miracle took place. As he was giving Holy Communion to a person possessed by the devil left him, and he was cured. His pastoral work began. He held a gathering of the priests, to whom he gave an address, emphasizing the value of the priesthood and its work. He also gave orthodox teaching to the laity. A large number of his homilies have been preserved, in which it is clear that he educated his flock with orthodox teaching. The development of the subjects shows a Holy Father who combined praxis with theoria, that is, action with vision, the lofty word with the simple. He spoke as an Athonite. Everyone wondered at the beauty of the words and those varied, solid, lofty, and marvelous visions and conceptual images. His homilies had an intensely therapeutic character. They cured men's souls. St. Hierotheos wrote about this, saying that every speech and homily that came from St. Gregory, quote, was all pure education of souls, mending of morals, warding off sin, teaching of virtue, and a philosophy of every good thing. His homilies cured by the excessive sweetness and power of the words that were outwardly heard, but at the same time entered the soul inwardly, like oil and honey, and captivated it. And in this way the listeners' souls were spiritually transformed. The words of the saint had this therapeutic character because they came from his heart, which had previously been transformed. They were not reflective words, but therapeutic ones. On reading his homilies, we are convinced of their therapeutic character. He speaks of repentance, of turning to God, of the illumination of man's nous, of the vision of God and the nature of the light of Tabor, of noetic prayer, and so forth. All these are words which show what a man must do in order to be inwardly cured. Certainly he was speaking like many contemporary Athonites whose words are experiential and therefore disarming and therapeutic. I have the conviction that every Orthodox speaker should study these homilies and guide his audience in this atmosphere. For these homilies have an Orthodox ethos, which is first and foremost therapeutic. Later we see the saint traveling by boat from Constantinople to Thessaloniki. A great wind arises, and all the passengers are on the point of despair. Then in the boat the saint, raising himself up between God and his fellow passengers, as a true mediator of God and men, with his unutterable inner supplications and his habitual boldness, he calms the storm, stops the raging of the sea, and unexpectedly saves them all from shipwreck. So even in the boat during the tempest, St. Gregory had noetic prayer. After this, and indeed after new trials in Thessaloniki, he was once more obliged to withdraw to his beloved Athos. And while his friends and disciples were incensed at the constant trials which he was facing, the saint, being an Athonite, said, "We must give thanks and rejoice over these trials, and show great gratitude to God, who has granted that we too may join the company of those great teachers and bishops of his, who, although they were saviors and fathers and benefactors in the spiritual affairs of the kings of that time, they were persecuted all their lives as criminals, as defiled and hostile, and in the end many were honored with death at their hands." The saint thanked God for all these trials and indeed considered them a special blessing from God because he was sharing in the passion of Christ and the holy apostles and fathers of the Church. The great Athonite fathers revered the saint. St. Hierotheos presents to us the opinions of two Athonite fathers, Savas and Germanos, who were the holy adornments of holy Athos regarding St. Gregory. They said that they would regard it as salutary and uplifting not only always to be with St. Gregory, but that it would be a great benefit and blessing to have his shoes, quote, carrying them about in their hands, to smother them with kisses and clasp them. He was also praised by many distinguished monks and hesychasts of that time, and this is especially worth noting, for what matters is not that we have the testimony of some conjecturers and people in authority, but that of the real disciples of Christ. Only the hesychasts, who possess a gift for discerning spirits, can have pure words. These great hesychasts called him, quote, a house of manifold wisdom and a protector of the common church of Christ, a champion of right belief, and a teacher of divine doctrines, and a guide to all that is best. Many of his contemporaries said that the saint was not at all inferior to the top-ranking theologian fathers. They also said that if the saint had been living in their times, they would have had him as a co-defender, co-general, and fellow counselor. And the laity itself regarded him as one of the God-bearing and apostolic men and teachers of old. St. Hierotheos, who wrote the saint's biography, spoke of his many gifts and virtues, which show him to be a great father of the Church. If we make a close study of these virtues, we shall see that they are true gospel virtues, which are seen especially in all who live on the holy mountain. The saint appears as an Athonite in this respect as well. He possessed every kind of virtue, both of action and of vision. He possessed meekness and humility of soul. He tolerated with patience those who were angry with him, and he did not easily accept those who were blamed on other people. His attitude toward rulers was, on the one hand, free of any servile fawning, and on the other hand, on some topics, he was hard and unmoving. To the humble, he was protective, exceedingly kind and philanthropic. He was uncompromising and unrelenting with regard to every sensual pleasure. He kept his heart calm and serene, and this flowed outward, so that all who saw him were made glad. All were amazed because they were observing him in practice, being rapt and broken-hearted and sober, from which also came that paradoxical and supernatural flow of tears. In general, St. Gregory was marveled at as having become a saint in these last and humble times. In all these things they discern the results and fruits of the stillness and the hesychia of the holy mountain. 4. The falling asleep of the saint. But also the end of the saint's life, his falling asleep, reminds us of the glorious holy Hagiorite departures. While in bed toward the end of his life, he spoke to those present about life and death and the soul. At the same time, he even foresaw the day of his departure. I know from my association with ascetics that this is held in great honor by the Athonite fathers. St. Hierotheos writes, quote, "So in the end he foretold his departure, having been informed from above and informing those around him, so that he foretold the day itself to his friends many days beforehand, saying that it would be right after the date of St. John Chrysostom's falling asleep." The saint was indeed hurrying toward heaven and the heavenly things. In the last moments of his life, he was not thinking or imagining anything. However, he kept saying, quote, "the heavenly things for the heavenly." He repeated these phrases until his soul left his body. He fell asleep at the age of 63. Immediately after he fell asleep, God showed signs of recognizing him as a saint. The room which held his lifeless body shone with a strange light, divine grace, just after his soul's departure, and it illumined his face with abundant radiance, although it was already dry and mostly mortified even before his death. The whole room shone with light, and at the same time his body radiated the divine grace dwelling in it. And thus, at his falling asleep, St. Gregory confirmed that he was a true Hagiorite and an unerring theologian of the Church. Divine grace further showed the saint's grave to be a home of divine light and a spring of miracles, a fountain of holy gifts of grace, and a public and free health center. From this small introduction, it can be seen clearly that St. Gregory was a true Athonite, a true Hagiorite, not only because he stayed on the holy mountain, but because he lived the life of the holy mountain, which in reality is the Orthodox life itself. If we compare all that we've said with the life of the contemporary Hagiorite fathers, we can see St. Gregory's spiritual kinship with them. They have the same way of life. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. One who expressed the hesychastic life of the holy mountain. In the preceding chapter, we looked at the life of St Gregory Palamas as analyzed by his fellow monk, St Philotheus Kokkinos, Patriarch of Constantinople, a man who expressed the same tradition and who entered St Gregory in the hagiology of the Church, writing his biography and the service in his honor. The biography, whose author was a saint as well, is a patristic text distinguished by plainness of speech, orthodoxy, and a nyptic atmosphere. We have seen analytically that St. Gregory was a Hagiorite. He lived on the holy mountain and experienced all of its life. He is a vivid sample of the life which existed on the holy mountain. As we read all the works of St. Gregory, we see the Athonite spirit rising like a fragrant incense. Therefore, we can say with certainty that St. Gregory Palamas and the holy mountain are very closely linked together, and no one can separate them without running the risk of one of them being distorted. If anyone looks at this saint, apart from the hesychastic tradition of the holy mountain, he will not be able to interpret him. And if anyone looks at the holy mountain, apart from the life and teaching of St. Gregory Palamas, he will not understand it, but will idolize it. So, in what follows, we must look at the influence of the holy mountain on the teaching of St. Gregory, or rather, see that the saint was expressing the hesychastic life that prevailed on the holy mountain, Athos. 1. The holy mountain and the Orthodox Church. In the first place, it must be said that the holy mountain is not independent of the Church. It is not a place set apart from the Church and made autonomous, but it is the way of life of the Orthodox Christian and the expression of the evangelical life in the Holy Spirit, which exists in the Church of Christ. In his work on the holy hesychast, St. Gregory, speaking of the holy confessor Nikephoros, who lived ascetically on the holy mountain and who professed orthodoxy and was therefore exiled by the first king of the house of the Pelagiologs, writes characteristically, quote, "He adopted the most rigorous way of life, that of the monks, and chose to live in the place which bears the name of holiness, Athos, on the border between the world and the supernatural, Athos being the home of virtue." In this passage, St. Gregory's conception of the holy mountain can be seen clearly. It bears the name of holiness. It is at the border between the world and the supernatural. It is the home of virtue. Therefore, we see the holy mountain as the home of virtue, as the place where the evangelical life is lived and expressed, which is the essence of our holy tradition. If the Holy Fathers teach that monasticism is the apostolic life, and the life of the martyrs, because the whole apostolic life and the witness of the holy martyrs is preserved in it, then we can understand that the holy mountain is the place where this apostolic and maritic life is lived. In order to confirm this truth, we need to look at the stages of the spiritual life according to the Holy Fathers of the Church. St. Dionysios the Areopagite says in his writings that according to the Holy Fathers, the spiritual life has 3 stages: purification, illumination, and deification, or perfection. We find this in the teaching of all the Holy Fathers of the Church. St. Simeon the New Theologian divided his chapters into 3 groups: practical, Gnostic, and theological. St. Gregory Palamas did the same. He divided them into ethical, which is purification, natural, and theological. This division showed the stages of the spiritual life as we find them in the teachings of St. Dionysios the Areopagite. But the same division is to be found in the teaching of St. Maximus the Confessor. St. Maximus speaks clearly about practical philosophy, which is primarily purification of the heart, about natural vision, which is illumination of the nous, and about mystical theology, which is vision, theoria of the uncreated light. And St. Nicodemus the Hagiorite, editing the Philokalia, gave it the following subtitle, which interprets its content, quote, "in which through the practice and vision of ethical philosophy the nous is purified, illumined, and made perfect," end quote. In this elucidation, we see the stages of the spiritual life: man's purification, illumination, and deification. Parallel with this, the Holy Fathers also divide the spiritual life in another way, into action, praxis, and vision, theoria. However, this is not a matter of another division clearly opposed to the preceding, but it's the same thing. For action is purification of the heart, and vision is illumination of the nous, and communion with God. In other words, when a man's heart is purified, which is the first stage of the spiritual life, this is followed by vision. Vision includes both illumination of the nous and vision of the uncreated light. In any case, action, praxis, precedes vision of God. For according to St Gregory the theologian, action is the patron of contemplation. We have made this analysis in order to emphasize that on the Holy Mountain, both during the period when St Gregory Palamas was living and in our own time, as well as in every part of the world where the Orthodox tradition is lived in the right way, there are these stages of spiritual perfection. Everyone who comes to the Holy Mountain in order to live in seclusion begins by purifying his heart, and this comes about and is completed through deep repentance. After this, he progresses to the illumination of his nous, which is unceasing inner noetic prayer. At such time as God wills, the person can also attain to the vision of God. We have seen this in the life of St Gregory Palamas, as St Hierotheos Kokkinos describes it to us. We see it also in the works of St Gregory himself. For instance, in the example which we mentioned before, speaking of the Holy Confessor Nikephoros, he tells the story of his life. That is to say, he describes how he reached the point of becoming a saint and a confessor. First of all, St. Nikephoros performed his obedience to the distinguished and discerning fathers. By his obedience, he let them experience his humility, and in return, he acquired the experience of the art of arts, which is Orthodox hesychia. After that, he became a leader for those who were struggling against the evil spirits. Here we see clearly the path followed by one who goes to the Holy Mountain in order to live in seclusion. First, he finds a spiritual guide, to whom he gives an obedience, Hieronda, and this is how purification of the heart begins. Through this effort of wise and discreet guidance on the part of his spiritual father, but chiefly through the help of divine grace, he receives the great gift of hesychia, which is unceasing prayer, liberating his nous from the onslaught of the reason and the passions. And when this succeeds, he is indeed the possessor of knowledge of God and becomes an unerring teacher and guide to other men. This whole process, which is still taking place on the Holy Mountain, as well as in every monastery that is living the Orthodox tradition, is the evangelical and apostolic life. The apostles followed Christ for 3 years, cleansed of their passions and the influence of the demons. And then on the day of Pentecost, they received the Holy Spirit, becoming members of the body of Christ and true theologians who spoke about God. Therefore, the Holy Mountain is an expression of the life of the Church, and every Athonite, like every monk, lives the apostolic life. So, the Holy Mountain is not only a place, but also a way of life. In this spirit, we can characterize St. Gregory Palamas as a Hagiorite, and with this interpretation, we maintain that he is one who expresses the life of the Holy Mountain, and more generally that of the Church. In this spirit, again, we can interpret all of the saints' works. Chapter 3 continued, one who expresses the hesychastic life of the Holy Mountain. 2. Orthodox hesychia. However, in saying that St. Gregory is one who expresses the hesychastic life of the Holy Mountain, we must examine just what hesychia is according to the Orthodox teaching. Hesychia, stillness, is essential for man's purification and perfection, which means his salvation. St. Gregory the theologian says epigrammatically, quote, one must be still in order to have clear converse with God and to bring the nous a little away from those wandering in error. End quote. Through hesychia, a man purifies his heart and nous from the passions and thus attains communion and union with God. This communion with God, precisely because it is man's union with God, also constitutes man's salvation. Hesychia is nothing other than keeping one's heart away from giving and taking and pleasing people, and the other activities. When a person frees his heart from thoughts and passions, when all the powers of his soul are transformed, and turned away from the earthly things and toward God, then he's experiencing Orthodox Hesychia. St. John of the Ladder writes that stillness of soul is, quote, the accurate knowledge of one's thoughts, and is an unassailable mind. Therefore, Hesychia is an inner state. It is dwelling in God. Of course, the Holy Fathers distinguish between external and internal stillness. External stillness is liberation of the senses and the body from sights, and particularly from the bondage which the world imposes, while inner stillness is liberation of the heart from images, fantasies, and worries. Hesychia of the body is usually the hesychastic position, and the person's attempt to limit as far as possible external representations, the images which our sensations receive and offer to the soul. Hesychia of the soul implies that the nous is able not to accept any temptations to stray. In this way, man's nous escapes from the outer world and enters his heart, which is where it really belongs. Thus, a person acquires peace in his heart, and there God himself is revealed. As we've seen, St Gregory Palamas lived this Orthodox Hesychia. At first he looked for a secluded spot on the holy mountain and prayed to God night and day. Then he attained inner Hesychia as well. Within this spiritual hesychastic atmosphere he acquired the knowledge of God at the time when the heresy appeared, which sought to unsettle the fundamental aspects of the Church's teaching. It was just then, since he had experience of this life, that he expressed it. It is only in this light that we must look at the life of St. Gregory. He was not just a student of the Holy Fathers, but one who had the same life and therefore also the same teaching as they. 3. Expression of the hesychastic life. In all his teachings we see the Hagiorite hesychast father who knows what hesychism is, but above all lives it. We can see this more analytically at two main points. First, in his dispute with Barlaam, and secondly, in his homilies to the flock of Thessaloniki when he was made Archbishop of Thessaloniki, as well as in other related homilies. A. His dispute with Barlaam. It was with difficulty that the saint began this dispute, because he did not wish to abandon the stillness of his life on the holy mountain. But when he was asked by his spiritual brothers, and when he himself realized that the faith was in danger of being altered, which would also have resulted in altering the means of man's cure, of losing the way of salvation, then he began his struggle. At first he did it with great humility and discretion. He finished one of his letters to Barlaam by saying that in spite of the reproach that he felt against Barlaam for his erroneous ideas on serious theological questions, he still maintained the same love for him. He called him a very wise man, the best of those who loved and were loved, and he emphasized that in spite of the dispute, the state of peace would be maintained. At the same time, he expressed the desire that they should meet, to embrace with a holy kiss. All these things imply a soul that has peace and stillness. Because of this hesychastic life, he could criticize the erroneous belief and at the same time keep peace and love. But also on the matters which were in dispute with Barlaam, we can see the hesychastic life of St. Gregory Palamas. He expresses the whole tradition of the Orthodox Church. At this point, we would like to look at several characteristic views taken from the first triad of his well-known work on the Holy Hesychasts. 3 topics are raised. The first one is the relationship between the two wisdoms, worldly and godly. The second is about noetic prayer, the return of the nous to abide in the heart, and the third is about the vision of the uncreated light. In the first part, he opposes Barlaam's view that human knowledge is a gift of God, and indeed of equal or higher value than the knowledge of the apostles and the prophets. This was why Barlaam had come to wrong conclusions. One of these was that the monks should pursue human education and human knowledge in order to be perfected. In answer to this view, St. Gregory maintains that man's aim is to progress from the image to the likeness of God. In his fall, man lost his direction toward the likeness, and the image was darkened. Therefore, he must now purify the image. But this does not come about through carnal wisdom, since the darkening of the image happens through sin. This means that when sin is removed, when man attains inner prayer, when his life is harmonized with Christ's commandments, and when he attains vision of God, then he is in fact in the image of God. Therefore, the philosopher's teaching is different from that of the Christians. St. Gregory emphasizes particularly that man purifies the image through Christ's commandments and the power of the cross of Christ. He refers to the cases of St. John the Forerunner and of Christ himself. The Holy Forerunner, he who is greater than the prophets, lived from his early years in the desert, where he points out there was no education, nor any of what Barlaam called saving philosophy. There were no books there, and no teachers of worldly wisdom. And we find the same thing in the life of Christ. When a young man asked what he should do to attain salvation and eternal life, he did not say, "If you want to be perfect, take up outward education, hasten to assimilate the sciences, acquire for yourself the science of beings." But he said, "Sell your possessions and give to the poor, take up the cross, and be willing to follow me." Therefore, in order to shame the outwardly wise, the Lord took on uneducated fishermen. At this point, St. Gregory refers to passages from epistles of the Apostle Paul, mainly from the first letter to the Corinthians, where it says that Christ took unlettered men in order to shame the outwardly wise, that God made foolish the wisdom of the world, that the world through its wisdom did not know God, and that through the foolishness of what was preached, he was pleased to save those who believe. Then, taking passages from Basil the Great and St. Gregory of Nyssa, he makes the distinction between demonic human knowledge and knowledge from the Holy Spirit, and naturally he prevents the monks from acquiring that worldly wisdom and knowledge. He ends his first section by saying that outward wisdom, meaning philosophy, quote, appeared futile and contemptible to our holy fathers, and especially to those who had experience of it. In the second part, he refers to the vast subject of prayer, and especially to what is called noetic prayer, where the nous is centered in the heart. Barlaam and his followers had said that it was not right to take our nous into the body, particularly into the heart. They said that the right thing was to take the nous out of the body. In reply to this view, which presupposes Plato's philosophical conceptions that the body is the prison of the soul and man's salvation is the soul's liberation from the body, he first uses the Apostle Paul's three passages. Quote, "Through holy baptism, the body became the temple of the Holy Spirit in us. The body is the house of God. And finally, God gave his promise, 'I will live with them and walk with them, and I will be their God.'" He emphasizes that the body is not evil, but it is a carnal attitude that is evil. When a person purifies his body through self-control, and the irascible and appetitive parts of the soul with self-control and love, and when he further makes his intelligence secure with prayer, then he sees divine grace in his heart. In what follows, he makes excellent anthropological analyses. He analyzes just what man's nous is, that the heart is the place of the rational faculty, the first rational organ of the body, that the nous is in the bodily organ of the heart, not as in a receptacle, but as in an organ which directs the entire body. Thus we must struggle to bring the nous back into the heart, where its natural place is. Being a great and holy hesychast, the saint brings into the soul that which also exists in God. Just as God has essence and energy, so also the soul has essence and energy. The soul's energy, which finds itself in the rational part and is flowing out through the senses toward creation, must return to the heart. Beginners in the spiritual life can succeed in this by controlling their breathing. When Barlaam and those who agreed with him scoffed at this method used by beginners, St. Gregory made very correct and very theological observations. The circular motion of the nous, that is to say, its return from the outside world to the heart, and its ascent from there to God, is the unerring method and the only way for man to acquire pure knowledge of God. But St. Gregory also made orthodox observations about the body's participation in prayer, as well as in the path to sanctity. The circularity of the body, too, is essential for the return of the nous to the heart. He says all these things because the Barlamites mock the hesychastics, who at the beginning of their spiritual life also make use of the circular pattern of the body. Omphilopsyche. The saint cites, excuse me the pronunciation, the saint cites the case of the prophet Elijah, who uses the circulatory of his body to bring his nous back into his heart and thus relieved the drought. Reader's footnote: the omphalo was a derogatory term used to refer to navel gazers, those who sat with the komboskini, with their head bowed, functioning the circularity of the body and bringing the nous back into the heart. So they were made fun of as navel gazers. To continue. In the third part, he refers to the fruits of prayer, which are the uncreated light and divine knowledge. Barlaam maintained that any light which is accessible to the senses is created, and therefore is lower than thought, man's rational faculty. So with his view that all external light is created and symbolic, he went so far as to consider the philosophers superior to the prophets and apostles, who saw the uncreated light. This part touches on many other topics, as well as that relate to this and other accusations by the Barlamites. First, he cites various patristic passages, according to which at the beginning of the spiritual life, the study of Holy Scripture is reduced, not in disparagement of it, but because we must first be purified through prayer. Then we will understand the spirit of the Scriptures. He cites other patristic passages as well in order to show how the body participates in noetic prayer, because often the heart itself leaps with joy at the coming of grace, and frequently a pleasant taste is created in the mouths of those who pray and chant, and this is the energy of divine grace. Then he makes the distinction between the light of natural knowledge and the light of the uncreated energies of the Holy Spirit. He concludes that natural knowledge is not the light of the soul. Thus, when the saints see the uncreated light, they see the garment of deification. He cites many patristic passages, and he surely interprets them within his own spiritual experience, which is the same as that of the Holy Fathers, that say that man can attain vision of the uncreated light. This light is not symbolic and created, but the shining of hypostatic light. It is divinity itself. The light on Mount Tabor is not a third hidden nature in Christ, but divinity itself. And toward the end of the third section, he refers to the great difference between the theologian and one who has seen God. A theologian can also be said to be one who speaks about God without even having his own personal experience. But a theoptesis is one who sees God. Theology differs from the vision of God in the same way as the knowledge of a thing differs from the possession of it. There are other places as well in the teaching of St Gregory Palamas where he refers to the great subject of the knowledge of God. He affirms that vision of the uncreated light is union with God. Union is communion, and this communion offers knowledge of God. True knowledge of God is superior to human created knowledge. And the saint demonstrates that in the Orthodox Church we teach that the prophets are incomparably higher than the philosophers. For the prophets of both the Old and New Testaments attained the vision of God, while the philosophers were making conjectures about God. In this analysis of the first triad of St. Gregory's work on the holy hesychastics, he is clearly shown to be a hesychast father, expressing the genuine hesychism which is expressed in the Panagia's garden, the holy mountain. Expression of the hesychastic life continued. B. His homilies. Apart from the polemic writings which have survived, there are also homilies by St. Gregory which show that he expressed the hesychastic life of the holy mountain. Some of these were addressed to the monks on the holy mountain on various feast days, and the rest were spoken to his flock in Thessaloniki. It is characteristic that in speaking to his Christians, he teaches noetic prayer, and thus shows that there is not a great contrast between monastic life and married life. From the abundance of passages which St. Gregory interprets hesychastically, I would like to select 4 in particular. The first refers to the interpretation of the parable of the publican and the Pharisee, and chiefly to the analysis of the prayer of the publican, which he presents as a type of hesychastic prayer. In this parable, the Lord, introducing the publican, said, quote, "But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.'" Luke 18:13. St. Gregory says, "Do you see the amount of humility and faith and self-reproach? Do you see the extreme contraction of his reason and senses, and at the same time the brokenness of heart mingled with the prayer of this publican?" From homily number 2 of St. Gregory's collected homilies. To continue, the words "at a distance" manifest humility and self-reproach. That he stood indicates the long continuation of his standing, as well as the persistence of his entreaty. That he would not even look up to heaven is both standing and submission, the portrayal not only of a lowly servant, but also that of one condemned. This way of praying and the position of his body shows right condemnation and self-reproach. That he beat his breast manifests his great contrition and deep mourning. "God, be merciful to me, a sinner," shows the value of the prayer of a single phrase. Pleading nothing else, thinking of nothing else, he was paying attention only to himself and God, rotating and multiplying this prayer of a single phrase, which is the most effective kind of prayer. Again, from homily 2. The second passage is about the meaning of the parable of the prodigal son. Here too St. Gregory interprets the parable hesychastically. St. Luke the evangelist presents Christ's parable in which we read, "Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living." Luke 15:13. St. Gregory does not analyze the parable in terms of morals, but theologically. He sets forth its true dimensions. Having the mind of Christ, experiencing the mystery of the Spirit, he grasps its true meaning. Belonging organically as he does to the Orthodox tradition, he realizes that the fall of man, the so-called ancestral sin, is in reality a darkening, obscuring, and deadening of the nous, whereas the resurrection of man is the vitalization of the dead nous. It is in this light that he also interprets the parable of the prodigal son. The nous is man's real wealth. Quote, "Above all else, the nous is our innate essence and wealth." End quote. As long as we remain on the way of salvation, quote, "we have our nous gathered in itself and in the first and highest nous, God." Our salvation is that we have our nous in God. But when we open a door to the passions, then our nous is immediately scattered, wandering all the time around things that are carnal and worldly, around the manifold pleasures and passionate thoughts about them. Then a man's nous becomes prodigal, and in general he is called prodigal. The wealth of the nous is prudence, and it distinguishes good from evil as long as we continue to keep Christ's commandments. But when the nous withdraws from God, then prudence too is scattered into prostitution and imprudence. Man's soul has not only a rational aspect, but also an appetitive and insensitive aspects. In its natural condition, man's nous directs desire toward the one and truly existing God, the only good one, the only judge, the only one who provides pleasure unmixed with any pain. But when the nous is in the unnatural state, when it departs from God and is darkened, then desire is dispersed into many self-indulgent appetites. Quote, "Drawn on the one hand toward a desire for foods that are not needed, secondly toward the desire for unnecessary things, and thirdly toward the desire for vain and inglorious glory." End quote. This comes about through desire. But when the nous is being deadened, the incensive power too is similarly taken captive. When the nous, in its natural state, when, that is to say, it is united with God, then it rouses the incensive power only against the devil and utilizes the soul's courage against the devil and the passions. But when it disregards the divine commandments, then one fights against one's neighbor, rages against those of the same race, is infuriated with those who do not assent to one's irrational appetites, and alas, one becomes a homicidal man. End of quote from St Gregory Palamas, homily number 3. The third passage is from the analysis which he gives of the Panagia's sojourn in the Holy of Holies. It is true that her entry into the Holy of Holies is not described in the Holy Scriptures, but it is an organic part of Orthodox tradition. The Church has established this whole teaching about the entry of the Panagia into the temple, and in fact it has a feast day for it. St. Gregory Palamas accepts this teaching of the Church and analyzes it theologically. In the temple, the Theotokos lived in paradise. She lived her life without equipment, unworried, carefree, without grief, having no part in base passions, above the pleasure that is not without pain, living only for God, seen only by God, nourished by God, guarded only by God, who was to dwell among us through her, she looking only at God, making God her delight, constantly devoted to God. End quote. From homily number 53 and homily 47 to continue. Since the Theotokos has been freed of any material tie and had even thrown off the relationship of sympathy toward her body, quote, she attached her nous to turning toward itself in both attention and unceasing divine prayer. And as she had come completely to herself through this and had overcome the multiform rabble of thoughts, she discerned a new and ineffable way to heaven, which I would call intelligible silence. And fixing the attention of her nous on this, she soared above all created things and saw God's glory better than Moses and kept an eye on divine grace. Homily 53. In the Holy of Holies, the Theotokos busied herself with noetic prayer and in this way attained intelligible Hesychia, silence. In this way she saw the glory of God better than Moses did. In other words, she attained the vision of God, theoria. And since this vision of God is union with God, therefore even before she conceived Christ, the Theotokos was united with the Trinitarian God. St. Gregory also takes this opportunity to give an account of the method of acquiring true theology. First, he says that speaking about God and meeting God himself are two different things. In order to speak about God, one needs to have speech, perhaps also art. Reasoning, too, is needed, and earthly examples offered by the senses. That is a way in which even many wise people of the world can speak about God, even men who have not undergone purification. But it is impossible to unite with God through reasonings and examples afforded by the bodily senses. One does not attain communion with God unless, in addition to purification, we go beyond, or rather above ourselves, leaving everything perceived by the senses as well as sensation, rising high above thoughts and reasonings and all knowledge and thought itself, wholly surrendered to the energy of noetic sensation, which Solomon forenamed a sense of the divine. When a person rises above thoughts and reason itself, then he can be united with God. The Theotokos chose this way to attain communion with God. She followed the way of Hesychia. Noetic Hesychia is nothing other than the standing still of the nous and the world. Seeking holy stillness, the Virgin found a guide, stillness of the nous, the world standing still, things below forgotten, sharing the secrets above, laying aside conceptual images for what is better. This stillness, this Hesychia, is the entrance to the true vision of God, which is the only example of a truly healthy soul. Virtue is a medicine for the ills of the soul and for the passions, while the vision of God is a fruit of the healthy soul. It is through the vision of God that man is deified. He is deified not through conjectural analogy, but through a hesychastic way of life. The Theotokos achieved Hezekiah and the vision of God in the temple, and she attained communion with the triune God. And anyone who wants to achieve this vision of God, which is man's salvation, must follow the way of life of the Theotokos. The only way is the way of Hezekiah. Finally, a fourth example of hesychastic teaching is the meaning in the passage of the Old Testament. There it says, quote, "On the seventh day he rested from all his work, and God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." Genesis 2:2-3. Interpreting this, the saint writes that there are works of God which he neither began to do nor ceased doing. He did not begin to act because he is without beginning, since, as Christ himself said, quote, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I am working." John 5:17. God's work without beginning is the knowledge of beings and the foreknowledge of things which are to be. Also, God's work without beginning and without ceasing is judgment and providence. In order to be created, beings need judgment and providence, but after creation they need judgment and providence as well, so that they may not disappear unseasonably, or some may change with time for the benefit of themselves or of the whole, and others may remain unchangeable. In other words, God, with his uncreated energy, which is called providence, continues to direct the whole creation for the fulfillment of his purpose. God directs creation by his providence. Another of God's works without beginning is, quote, "the return to himself, for he moved without beginning in self-contemplation, the vision of himself." Since God neither began to do nor ceased doing, what then is God's rest? Why does Moses say that God rested after his labors? Rest is the way back, quote, "from the things below to those things that are greater and supra-cosmic," end quote, from St Gregory. In his creation in 6 days, God was outside himself through his extreme goodness. He condescended in his love for mankind. On the seventh day, after the creation of the whole world, of the senses, he returned, as befits him, to his own height, which he had never left. And God blessed this rest in order to show us that we should value the knowledge of the beings of nature more highly than the things of the senses. Also to indicate to us, to teach us and ask us to enter as far as we can into that rest ourselves, which is our noetic vision of God, and through it the movement upward toward God. This is the framework in which these things are interpreted by St. Gregory in the apostolic words. Quote, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from his own work, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter into that rest." And to quote from Hebrews chapter 4, 9-11. In reality, our own rest is hesychism, noetic stillness, which is rest from the world and the return of the nous to the heart. In analyzing this rest, the saint says that we first pay heed to the teaching of the Spirit, since we are ridding ourselves of the lower, ceaseless, and toilsome cares, and laying aside the works connected with them. Then we prefer these words of the Holy Spirit to every passionate and worldly thought, and we ponder them in our nous, which is to say, our heart. After that, if we remove every thought, even if it be a good one, from our nous, and through constant attention and nipsis and unceasing prayer, the nous returns to itself, then we enter the divine rest, which is the vision of God. For more, see St Gregory Palamas' homily number 17. All this noetic Hezekiah, as described by the Holy Fathers, who are basically hesychists, is the way which leads to the divine rest, to the vision and theoria of God. and we believe that the hesychastic way of life is what makes a person orthodox. It is the basis of the dogmas and all the truths of the faith. Apart from this, there is no true theology. After all this, it is clear that St Gregory Palamas is one who expresses the hesychastic life of the Holy Mountain. His stay on the Holy Mountain, his obedience to the discerning spiritual fathers and elders, and the experience which he acquired made him a true theologian, a great father of the Church. In all his works, whether it be polemics or homilies, his hesychastic life is seen. He lived the life of the Holy Mountain and became a Hagiorite, and this, of course, is identical with being orthodox. End of chapter 3.